This is the final part of this story. Welcome to True Taley's journey. My parents kicked me out at 18. 10 years later, they begged me to save the family business.
Hello friends, my name is Adrian Walker. I'm 18-year-old.
The next morning, Richard Walker sat silently in his office holding Adrian's old photograph, while Alina began searching online for any trace of the son they had erased from their lives a decade earlier. Neither of them expected what appeared on the screen moments later. Article after article featured a name they instantly recognized. Adrian Walker, founder and CEO of Vanguard Systems, one of New York's fastest-growing enterprise technology companies. Richard stared at the screen in complete disbelief. The same son he had thrown out with nothing had somehow built a multi-million-dollar company entirely on his own, and suddenly an uncomfortable truth settled heavily in the room. Alina continued reading interview articles describing Adrian as a self-made entrepreneur who had transformed small startup beginnings into a company now valued in the hundreds of millions. Richard remained speechless as every sentence felt like a brutal reminder of how wrong he had been all those years. Adrian had not only survived without family support, but had built something larger than anyone inside the Walker family expected possible. Yet instead of feeling pride, Richard felt fear. Because now he understood exactly what they needed to do next. They would have to face the son they abandoned and ask him for help. Meanwhile, several miles away inside Vanguard Systems headquarters overlooking downtown Manhattan, Adrian sat reviewing acquisition reports while sunlight reflected across the floor-to-ceiling glass windows surrounding his office. At 28 years old, he looked nothing like the frightened teenager abandoned during that stormy winter night years earlier. Expensive tailored suits had replaced worn janitor uniforms, confidence had replaced fear, and success had erased every trace of weakness his father once believed defined him. But despite everything he had achieved, Adrian never imagined that on this ordinary afternoon, the past he buried 10 years earlier was quietly preparing to walk back into his life. As Adrian prepared for an investor meeting, his assistant entered carrying a message that immediately froze the atmosphere. She explained that 2 visitors had arrived unexpectedly asking to speak with him privately and insisted the matter was urgent. Adrian casually asked for their names, expecting another investor or corporate executive. Instead, she quietly answered with 2 words he had not heard spoken together in nearly 10 years. Richard Walker, Alina Walker. For several seconds, Adrian simply stared at the city skyline beyond the window, while emotions he thought had disappeared years earlier suddenly returned with surprising intensity. Adrian slowly stood from his chair and remained silent while memories flooded back instantly. He remembered the freezing rain outside the mansion, the slammed front door, the disconnected phone service, and endless nights wondering whether survival itself was possible. The pain of betrayal returned with remarkable clarity despite years of success, separating him from that moment. Part of him wanted to refuse the meeting immediately and force them to experience rejection for the first time. But curiosity won. After 10 years of silence, only one explanation could justify their sudden appearance. Something serious had gone terribly wrong. Moments later, Richard and Alina entered the executive conference room where Adrian stood calmly near the windows waiting for them. Neither parent could hide visible shock at what surrounded them. Massive digital displays covered the walls. Employees moved confidently through modern office spaces outside the glass doors, and expensive design elements reflected extraordinary success everywhere they looked. Richard had spent decades building traditional manufacturing wealth, yet even he recognized the scale of what Adrian had created. The son he once called foolish now stood surrounded by an empire far beyond anything Richard expected. The balance of power had completely shifted. For nearly 10 uncomfortable seconds, nobody spoke. Richard, once a man who controlled every room he entered, now looked strangely smaller standing across from the son he had abandoned. Alina's eyes filled with visible guilt as she quietly studied Adrian's face, noticing how age and hardship had transformed him into someone emotionally distant and impossible to read. Finally, Richard cleared his throat and forced out words he clearly never expected to say. He admitted that the family business was facing severe financial difficulties. Adrian listened silently, offering no visible reaction whatsoever, as if hearing details about strangers instead of family. Richard carefully explained how Walker Luxury Furnishings had suffered devastating losses after several failed expansion strategies, damaged supplier relationships, and dangerous debt obligations accumulated over recent years. Aliner added that multiple banks were threatening legal action, and bankruptcy now seemed unavoidable without immediate intervention. Adrian remained completely expressionless while listening to every detail. It struck Richard almost immediately how strange the situation felt. 10 years earlier, he had controlled Adrian's future completely. Now he sat asking for mercy from the same son he once treated as disposable. Power had reversed itself so thoroughly that even speaking felt humiliating. After several painful minutes of explanation, Richard finally reached the real purpose behind the visit. He admitted they needed help restructuring the company immediately, and believed Adrian's financial success made him uniquely capable of saving the Walker Empire before total collapse became irreversible. The sentence itself sounded surreal. Richard Walker, once one of New York's most feared businessmen, was now openly begging assistance from the son he considered weak and irresponsible. Adrian slowly leaned back against the conference table while studying both parents carefully. For years, he imagined this exact moment many times, but reality felt strangely calmer than expected. Before Adrian could answer, the conference room door suddenly opened and Lucas Walker entered aggressively after rushing from the family company headquarters. Richard had apparently informed him where the meeting was happening, and Lucas clearly hated everything unfolding in front of him. Without hesitation, he accused Adrian of enjoying the family's suffering and acting superior simply because he had gotten lucky in the technology industry. Adrian looked at Lucas calmly while recognizing the exact same arrogance that existed 10 years earlier. Some people changed through struggle. Others remained trapped inside entitlement forever, incapable of learning even when disaster surrounded them completely. Lucas continued blaming external market conditions for the company's collapse while refusing to acknowledge his own disastrous leadership decisions had directly created most financial damage. Richard attempted to interrupt several times, but Lucas ignored him completely, frustrated by the humiliation of needing Adrian's help. Adrian quietly observed everything unfolding and suddenly understood something deeper. The Walker family had not learned anything from the past decade. Richard still protected pride above accountability, Lucas still refused responsibility, and Aliner still stood silently between conflict without changing anything. 10 years had passed, yet the emotional structure inside this family remained exactly as broken as before. Adrian finally spoke for the first time since the meeting began, and the calmness in his voice immediately silenced everyone. He asked a single question. Had any of them ever considered apologizing for what happened 10 years earlier before arriving to request millions of dollars in assistance? The question landed heavily across the room. Richard lowered his eyes instantly, while Aliner visibly struggled with emotion. Lucas rolled his eyes impatiently, as if the past no longer mattered. Adrian noticed every reaction carefully. In that moment, he realized they had not come because they regretted hurting him. They had only come because desperation forced them. Richard finally stood up slowly and admitted something Adrian never expected to hear. He said forcing Adrian out of the house had been the biggest mistake of his entire life. He confessed that pride blinded him and that he had spent years believing obedience mattered more than understanding his own children. Aliner quietly apologized through tears, admitting she should have defended Adrian instead of remaining silent that night. For a brief second, the room felt emotionally fragile, almost genuine. But Adrian had spent 10 years learning an important lesson. Words meant very little when spoken only after consequences became unavoidable. Adrian walked slowly toward the massive conference room window overlooking Manhattan while considering everything they had said. For years he believed revenge meant watching his family suffer exactly as he once suffered. But standing there now, seeing them reduced by fear and desperation, he realized something surprising. Their downfall had already happened long before this meeting began. Richard's pride had destroyed him. Luca's arrogance destroyed the company. Aliner's silence destroyed trust. They had spent 10 years creating their own punishment. Yet Adrian still had one final move prepared, something none of them could possibly anticipate. Turning back toward the room, Adrian calmly announced that he had spent several weeks studying major manufacturing acquisition opportunities throughout New York and had recently developed interest in distressed companies carrying strong legacy infrastructure. Richard looked confused by the sudden shift in conversation, while Lucas folded his arms impatiently. Adrian then reached inside his leather briefcase and slowly placed several legal documents onto the conference table between them. Nobody moved at first. Richard glanced downward, scanning unfamiliar corporate purchase agreements connected to multiple private investment groups operating quietly behind the scenes across recent months. As Richard continued reading, his face suddenly lost all color. Through strategic private investment channels and debt restructuring agreements negotiated weeks earlier, Adrian had already acquired controlling financial leverage connected directly to Walker Luxury Furnishings' outstanding obligations. Simply put, before this meeting even happened, Adrian had positioned himself to legally take majority ownership of the family company if financial defaults continued exactly as projected. Lucas grabbed the documents aggressively, reading faster as panic spread visibly across his expression. Neither father nor brother understood how Adrian had quietly moved several steps ahead while they were still drowning inside problems he anticipated long ago. Adrian calmly explained that months earlier Vanguard Systems analysts identified Walker Luxury Furnishings as a vulnerable acquisition target after studying severe cash flow instability spreading through the manufacturing sector. At first, the opportunity looked purely financial, but once Adrian recognized his own family company among distressed assets, he made a personal decision. Instead of watching strangers dismantle the Walker empire piece by piece, he positioned himself strategically for complete takeover. Richard stared at his son with disbelief while understanding something devastating. Adrian had become a businessman even more calculating than himself. The boy he discarded had evolved into someone terrifyingly capable. Silence consumed the room as Adrian stepped closer toward his father and spoke words carrying 10 years of buried pain beneath perfect emotional control. He reminded Richard of one lesson learned the night he was abandoned in freezing rain, with nothing except an old backpack and fear. Nobody helps weak people survive. Richard himself taught that lesson personally. Adrian explained that everything he built afterward came from understanding one brutal truth. Dependence creates vulnerability, and vulnerability invites cruelty. That painful night destroyed the son Richard once knew. In his place, it created someone who would never again allow others control over his future. Adrian finally delivered the decision everyone feared most. He announced he would save Walker Luxury Furnishings, but not by handing over money or restoring family control. Effective immediately, his acquisition agreements transferred majority ownership directly under his authority, meaning Richard and Lucas would permanently lose executive control over the company they once believed defined family power forever. Lucas exploded in outrage while Richard simply stood frozen, understanding resistance was impossible. The empire he built across 40 years no longer belonged to him. The son he abandoned had returned, not seeking revenge through destruction, but through absolute control. Hours later, Adrian stood alone near the windows watching the Manhattan skyline as Richard, Alina, and Lucas quietly left the building carrying the full weight of consequences they spent 10 years creating. There was no celebration inside Adrian's expression, only calm understanding. 10 years earlier, they believed survival without family support would destroy him forever. Instead, hardship became transformation. The frightened teenager forced into the streets had rebuilt himself stronger than anyone imagined possible. Sometimes life punishes arrogance in ways far more powerful than anger ever could. And on that cold New York afternoon, the Walker family finally learned never to underestimate the person forced to rebuild alone. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more True Tales journey.